All right, so I've given this presentation in a number of different formats. Kind of what I'm going to talk about today specific with this is not just the site and what's been done over the years and what we had a chance to do, but is also what we hope we can prove or at least verify or refute is that this shipwreck's identity is something that we can know. There's been very few documented shipwrecks from the early 16th century. By that, I mean the 1500 through 1525 mark, that first quarter. There's about 4 shipwrecks throughout the United States, Central South America, and this wreck still represents one of the best we know about. So without further ado, we'll dive in here. This is the Highbourne Cay Wreck. So to give a little backup real quick, when we talk about ships of exploration and of this time period, I'd like to put it into context. So we had this great medieval period that lasted from about 500 AD to about 1500 AD. Really, it was the fall of Rome, leading all the way through the Middle Ages to then what we say the start of the modern period, the early modern period. That really gets kicked off in a lot of different places around the globe right around 1492 or 1500 to be a little bit looser. But that voyage of Columbus had such an impact that it really led to the process of globalization. So the world went from barely knowing itself and knowing who was out there to rapidly knowing who was out there and who your threats and who your friends were. And very quickly, ideas and concepts and genes and animals and plants, diseases, all of these started getting exchanged in a very rapid time frame. And so it led to a dramatic change of the planet. Well, all of this happened with a little ship called the Caravel. And so we think that this shipwreck at Highbourne Cay either represents a caravel or a very similar type of ship type that's from that early 16th century, that exploration age. And so here I just want to give you a quick idea that in Europe we had 2 main shipbuilding styles. One that you'll know of is the Viking style. It's a very long, low-sided ship. They tend to be built with overlapping planks, what we call lap strake planking. And they had these big square sails, and they eventually developed a stern-hung rudder. So that came with a square stern. This ship type, since it was built with split planks, so a log would literally be split into pieces rather than be sawn into planks, which is the more common Mediterranean style, or the style that we do today. Because that was the case, you had very heavy timbers, and it was very hard to build up a ship into very large sizes and still keep it to be structurally sound. So their ships tended to get longer, and the freeboard, the side that comes from the water up, didn't get as high over time. You just added more and more length. And so you had very long Viking ships that kind of typified the period before they started stacking and building up higher and higher. Well, that lasted for a lot of the medieval period, where we had a different type of shipbuilding down here in the Mediterranean. So these 2 distinctive styles. One, as you can kind of see in that 3D model of a shipwreck, they had these triangular sails, which you call lateen sails, that instead of being set perpendicular to the ship's keel, they ran fore and aft with the ship. We didn't really see a square sail like you see with the Vikings down in the Mediterranean, at least it wasn't that common. They also had a very different type of putting their planks together. They would edge join those planks, so literally stacking on top of each other. And there was different ways to make this happen, but they didn't have that overlapping plank style that the Viking traditions did. Over time, really in the 1400s, as we're leading up to that big momentous 1492, these ship types started to coalesce right around the Atlantic regions of Portugal, Spain, and France. And so we saw a new ship type start to develop that was borrowing these features. It led to what we understand as the modern version of a ship. And the first few examples of what we call a ship's rig, where you have, as you can see, a square sail in the center there, that main mast has a square sail that's pulled all the way up, and these lateen sails. In this case, it has 2 on the back in its rear masts. And so it was combining these different sail rigs so that it was less effort to be able to sail across an entire ocean and then still navigate effectively when you got to the other side. So these big square sails were very easy to run with the winds. You could drop down your sail and just ride for days with the wind behind you. And so if you had the right currents in the Atlantic and the right winds, You could put yourself on one side, drop your main sails, and you would arrive at the other side in a few weeks. That was hard to do with lateen sails because it takes a lot of effort to control them. So again, those triangular ones. But they're very good at navigating a ship in and out of shallow bays, lots of nooks and crannies that has to spin up and down coastlines. And so if you're exploring a new world, for example, you'd use a lot of those lateen rigs rather than the square rig. And so when you had a ship built of both, you kind of had the best of both worlds. The stern-hung rudder, as you can see on this replica caravel here, was adopted as well from the north. But that edge-laid planking, what you call carvel planking, of where the edges of the planks are laid together, became the common one. And really it had to do with this philosophy of shipbuilding where it was coalescing right around Portugal and Spain. And they were building what would become the first ships that could successfully cross oceans repetitively. And so kind of ironically, I had to show this picture. There was a replica of one of Santa Clara, which was Columbus's Nina, and it's been built and sailing for many years. In this recent storm over in Pensacola, the ship was visiting and it got caught and then thrown up on shore. Now, if you know about Pensacola, the University of West Florida, they have been researching a fleet of 7 ships that wrecked from 1559. Early Spanish ships, and they found 3 of them so far. And then here you go, you have another one visiting Pensacola, and yet another storm wrecks another 16th century ship. And we thought all the 16th century ships had already wrecked. So here, we're proven wrong. Kind of a wonderful situation. Don't worry, no one was hurt. So I mentioned those 4 early shipwrecks that we've got. So really you can say 1492 to 1520. There are several hundred ships that we know about. 100 had been documented previously, and we've been adding a few to that list. But those are historical examples of known ships to have wrecked in the region. What we have here, and you see kind of circled in red, are the 4 known early 16th century ships throughout all of the continents. And it's surprising because this suite of ships has really only added 1 other since they were first found in the 1960s. So some early wreck work was done. Most of it was salvage based. And then only in 2000s did this one down here in Panama actually get found in the early 2000s. So we still have very few of these ships, despite how significant they were. And so just to repeat, these were the first ships that could sail not only across the Atlantic Ocean, but by 1521, Magellan's voyage completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. And so within about 30 years, you had humans crossing oceans and then going all the way around the planet, not only proving it was round, but knowing all of the different sea routes and the possibilities, at least, of how many different places that you could go and from which directions. The Caravel was the only ship in each of those initial voyages to successfully make it. So Santa Maria, Columbus's famed flagship, wrecked on its first voyage, and only Nina and Pinta, which were both caravels, returned. And then a single caravel of Magellan's, when he brought 4 and 2 other larger ships. Only a single ship actually made it at the end of that 3-year voyage. So it was a remarkable little vessel and often the favorites of many sailors. One of the important takeaways when we start talking about circum-Caribbean archaeology, the greater Caribbean area, is that in part because of the beautiful clear water and in part because of the activities that were going on for that time period, many of these ships have been attractions to lots of treasure hunters and the avid explorer. And so we've seen a number of these ships get destroyed and salvaged in the process of people wanting to either loot them or just even know more about them. And so in every situation that you see here, each one of these 4 vessels has been partially looted or destroyed in some form. We don't have a single early 16th century shipwreck in the Americas that has been studied by archaeologists before it got damaged by looters. And so every single site has been partially damaged, some even blown up by pipe bombs in pursuit of gold, and sometimes angry treasure hunters getting mad at archaeologists. So the whole period is still fraught with lots of questions. And if we could find one concrete identity with just one of these ships, we would start to know that much more about which islands were named what. The maps were still very early in their developments, and so the names themselves get quite confusing, and that much more about context and reference as we look through the historical record. So connecting just one identity could be very helpful. So as we touch here on the Highbourne Cay wreck itself, So it's named after the island of Highbourne Cay. We're in the Exumas, Bahamas. And so you can see kind of that partial landmass where the red line is coming out of, that's Florida. That little corner landmass in the lower left, that's Cuba. And so the Bahamas is just outside the technical Caribbean. It's on the North Atlantic plate in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's a set of about 3,000 different islets, keys, and islets over a very broad area. Most of this country, over 60, 70%, depending on how you calculate it, is water. So much of that country has this maritime component. And if you can see, it's often been described as the most beautiful place to see from space, but you have very clear water because it's getting filtered so regularly by all of its limestone, and you have all of these shallow embankments. So where you can kind of see swirling light blue water, those are usually shallow areas anywhere from 10 to 70 feet deep. They're usually not that deep. And then you see the dark blue areas, that's thousands of feet deep. And so you get this very complex island form development and current exchange that's happening, but it creates a very vibrant, beautiful, and clear environment. It was also the first place that Columbus landed. He landed on a place called Guanahani, still debated, but is believed to be modern San Salvador. And so putting all this together could be very helpful for us to understand the story. Where that red line ends is in Nassau, and you can see that dotted line heading down is the route we take to get to the northern Exuma Islands, very small chain of islands, and that's Highbourne Cay. So that island is on your lower right there, and I'll show you some nice shots here in a little bit. But that is the overall region. This is a drone shot of our working area. So the shipwreck is located just off the coast, about 100 and 150 meters or so. This will be of importance later, actually, as we start to talk about how we're figuring out this identity and what we're learning from the site. John Broadwater, who's on this call as well, he actually got to come out for several weeks and assist us with our big excavation in 2017. So I was coming back and forth from the region for many years, and then finally in 2017, National Geographic and the Institute of Nautical Archaeology funded much of our work so we could go out there for about 2 months. We still had a few weeks left we wanted to get done, but of course Hurricane Irma is what kicked us off site. So we kind of had to close up shop as quickly as we could and put the artifacts in safe storage on the island and run in front of the storm. It was its own little adventure. You can see that little vessel off to the left. That was our research boat. And right below it, there's looks like a clear triangle with a set of white sandbags, a clear rectangle with a set of sandbags. You can also see some sandbags up just off the bow of the ship as well. These were our main working areas. You'll get to see some more of. So this is looking down the island. You can see it's very thin. It rises to about 25 feet at its highest point. It's about 2 miles long, but it's a beautiful place to be forced to work on beautiful shipwrecks. It is home to, so it's a private island, but it is home to a marina and a little restaurant, a little store. It's mainly been preserved by a group of Bahamians who did not want the island to get developed. So it was kind of known in the 60s and 70s as not too far from Nassau, a place you could go and do some wonderful snorkeling, walk some beautiful beaches. And then when the idea that it might get developed came up, there's a couple of people who purchased it and just try to keep the island to be self-sufficient. So it treats a lot of the very wealthy, famous people. The Exumas is a known yachting paradise, but you get all the pit bulls and Shakiras and all the other stars on their yachts that will come and frequent this place. So it can be, they certainly have different priorities than many of the archaeology projects that we're used to operating off of. Here is just a little shot of the inland of the bay. And if you can see right in the middle there, there's a little white capped tent just north of those boats. That's our little field station, our work. And we would have to drive a little golf cart just north off this picture every day, hop on some small boats that would take us out to the site so we could work off of the main ship that you saw earlier. Our little field station here. Now, one of the things that makes this site fascinating is that it's been revisited on a number of occasions. And so this makes it both useful and very tricky when you're trying to do research. It's useful in the sense that we've had both salvers, amateur archaeologists that have worked on the site in the 60s, and a group of very talented archaeologists that worked on the site in the 80s. And there's a lot of prevailing work that they've done that we can reference. The challenge is that the site has been disturbed heavily on both of those time periods. And so we've lost artifacts and locations of sites, and it's sometimes tough to trust provenience. and to know what came from where. And that's become more of a problem recently as we've been getting closer and closer to establishing the identity of the vessel, as we're missing some key bits of information. But in the 60s, the site was first identified by a couple of gentlemen you can see in that picture. They were snorkeling over the top and they saw what looked like cannons and anchors sitting on top of a reef. So they applied for a permit. They kind of did all the right things for the era. They contacted the Smithsonian, and a gentleman named Mendel Peterson, who was very well known for studying artillery of the time period, was interested in maritime archaeology. He had been working in Bermuda with a very famous treasure hunter named Teddy Tucker, but they considered themselves pioneers of underwater archaeology. And so they were often doing work to the best of their abilities to archaeological standards, in the sense that they were trying to record provenience, get measurements of everything, document with photos and videos, etc. They were trying to approach in that manner. We do know that George Bass was excavating shipwrecks with a much higher degree of accuracy over in the Mediterranean in this same decade. And so it was certainly possible to do so, but these early visits were kind of still a part of establishing what was good and bad archaeology. The downside is that they decided to remove most of the metallic objects they could find. So they raised all of those swivel guns. They raised a total of 13. That's what they're holding there in their hands. Those are swivel guns or anti-personnel guns, and they're all made of early wrought iron materials. They also lifted 2 cannons. If you can see in that upper right picture, these long cannons called tube guns or bombardetas. They have these rings. They kind of look bumpy. They're really thin, also known as the Spanish pea shooter. But these were early wrought iron forms of artillery that we kind of know to be hallmarks of 16th century ships. And so those were the first clues to the dating, and Mendel Peterson was pretty aware of these things. But they lifted all of the breech blocks. Those are those other semi-round cylindrical features you see behind those cannons. These weapons kind of functioned like a shotgun, where you had preloaded shells in those breech blocks. You would slot one in the back, wedge it in, then you'd fire it, and you'd take out the whole canister and you'd put in another. So this wasn't your muzzle loading type of cannon that you've seen before, where you have to load and pack from the mouth of the cannon going inwards. You would load a cartridge on the back and it would fire out, and then you could remove the cartridge and put another one in. So oftentimes you'd have preloaded cartridges in case there was an encounter, and you could fire much more rapidly. The guns were notoriously terribly made. They would often backfire and not fire at all. Sometimes the balls would just dribble out the barrel after a very loud explosion. So they weren't very well trusted. And many of the people at the time period in the 16th century write about how dreadful these early bombardetas were. So they didn't last long on the high seas, and they were switched out before the end of that era. We've got records in the 1570s that says these have been being removed from common use. So here's just a short video of the 1960s guys working. That's Teddy Tucker. He's bouncing around on top of the shipwreck as they are lifting one of these swivel guns. There's some painful moments you can see here. They're just yanking this thing off the reef. It was concreted heavily on top. And as you see in the next shot, as they kind of lift it up, that process very realistically put a slight curve in the anchor shaft. You can kind of see there. And so definitely not a recommended excavation technique, but this was commonly done, at least in the 50s and 60s, to get materials out before people took a bit more time to do these kinds of things. What they walked away with were a set of conclusions, though, and this is where my interests in the research have started to come in. And there are some very smart perspectives that they had, and then there are some ones that I still question, and I wonder, where did this conclusion come from? So this is the journey that we're on now, is trying to say, what are these mysteries, and can they tell us more about why the shipwreck is there? So to put it in context a little bit, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that orange X is the shipwreck. Those black lines that you see coming off of the wreck, that is north, essentially, those were anchor lines. And there was 2 anchors that were found spaced a reasonable distance apart from each other by the guys in the 1960s. They raised and removed both of those anchors. We've got some pictures of them, but they're not the best, so it's tough to tell. But they made the assumption that these 2 anchors were thrown out of the ship, and the ship came grinding to a stop. One of the reasons they think that is because of these big green arrows. What I'm saying here is that there's a very fast current that cuts between these areas. So literally in the Bahamas, when you have a thin chain of islands that separates you from east and west, like the Exumas does, you have to find a suitable cut, a body of water that allows you to sail from one side to the other. And there's only a handful of suitable cuts throughout the entire Exumas. This happens to be one of the best, and the best in the north. So this was likely a place to transit back and forth, even during the Spanish age, as we do have a shipwreck here, but it might have been a known place to target. Despite how low Highbourne Cay is, it is one of the higher islands in the region. All the islands are very low. So it might have been another island you would have spotted, one of the first islands you would have spotted as you were approaching it from the east. And so there was reason to believe that they would have known that this was a transit there. But because the current switches back and forth with the tide, you get this very complex environment. The current can run as fast as 7 knots on the flood. So when that deep water is welling up on the flood tide, 7 knots is about as fast as we've been able to clock it. Michael Phelps swims about 2.5 knots. So it's a very difficult environment, especially for diving and doing your operation. The saving grace is at slack tide. As the current slows down, switches direction, then it runs about 3 or 4 knots as it floods back out. And then you get this moment of calm, about 20 minutes, where everything is still before the current picks back up and rushes in the other direction. Well, if that vessel threw out 2 anchors and it came to a stop, you can see from its setup that it would have had to throw out its anchors when the current was running in that direction on the flood. And then it would have sunk before it had a time to switch directions. Interestingly, if that happened, this ship would have had to anchor and would have had to sink within 6 hours before the current switched. And mainly because the distance between shore and the shipwreck is less than the distance between the shipwreck and its anchors. So if this vessel had only 2 bow anchors, then it would have been free floating during slack tide, and it could have had the risk of being blown into shore. In fact, that can happen anyways, just sitting on 2 anchors, even when the current is strong. And so one of my big questions is, why on earth would anyone ever anchor here in such a manner? It just doesn't make sense. It's very, very dangerous, and any captain would have avoided it at all costs. You also could have thrown out your anchors at anywhere in the cut, and even 1 anchor would have been safer to spin around on if the current was switching and you were trying to repair your vessel. But the assumption in the 1960s was they were in such a bad state that they came around, they were hugging the coast, they threw out their anchors as quick as they could, and they just ground to a halt. And then the ship wrecked shortly afterwards. The trouble I've always had with that is that when they were looking at the site, when the archaeologists in the 80s and when we're looking at the site, we're not finding any personal possessions, we're not finding any cargo, we're not finding any high value materials like navigational instruments. It looks like the shipwreck has been completely cleaned out. And that means that the crew had time to get all of their personal possessions. They had time to move water and food stores, because we have a limited number of ceramics that we found. And there's no navigational devices or other things. So there was time for the crew to get off the vessel. So if the theory holds that they threw out their anchors to come to a screeching stop before the ship sunk, somehow the crew would have had to get off that ship multiple times on the ship's boat, rowing against a 7-knot current, and somehow do that within 6 hours before the tide switched. To me, it just sounds incredibly unlikely. So there's more to this story than we know, but that was at least the initial assumption. The ship's from the mid, maybe earlier 16th century. It's got real sharp lines, which an early 16th century caravel would. The ship was in trouble. It threw out its heaviest anchors. Its cannons were stowed when it wrecked. And because of this lack of personal objects and other things, perhaps it was even scuttled, which kind of goes against their earlier hypothesis. So some questions that had remained unanswered. In the 1980s, another group of archaeologists came and visited the site. They were interested in a different early 16th century shipwreck. And I'll just run right back up to this map I showed you earlier. They were working at the site down in the Turks and Caicos. So that one just above Puerto Rico on the farthest right. They were headed there, and they had read this early report from the National Geographic series of these salvors that worked on the site and thought they'd swing by and take a look. So they really had a day to drop on the site. And then they said, wow, there's a lot here. We have to go back. And they planned a 6-week excavation to come and look at more stuff. So when they came down, they opened up a trench that you can see there in the image. And lo and behold, a wonderfully preserved center line of a shipwreck was found. They opened the trench right on the mast step, where the mast comes down and sticks into the bottom of the vessel, a really key construction feature. They found the master frame, which is the main frame of the ship that helps control the overall size and shape. And so what they were able to do was to find a very well-preserved diagnostic section of the hull, something that had never been seen before, and record some of our earliest understandings of ship construction and how the ship was actually built. As you can see in the site plan down there, they opened up some of the bow and stern. That was also opened up in the 1960s, and so they were kind of reinvestigating. But they did find sections of the keel, and then parts of the keel that had actually ground away the limestone. So there was what they called a trough that went down about a foot and was about a foot wide, and had a long straight line exactly where the keel was, that as the ship was rocking back and forth on the seabed, it didn't fall all the way over onto one side, as most shipwrecks do, mainly because it had 2 anchors kind of holding it up by the bow. It just ground away the limestone beneath it and created this trough that luckily gives us the exact length of the shipwreck's keel for archaeologists coming back to see the site. So they came up with similar conclusions. What they said after all their work, they didn't really recover many artifacts. They did look around and describe some, but this wasn't their main project. So they didn't raise or conserve anything. They did try to track down some of the old artifacts. We have some of their information, but they also said, yes, this looks like a lightly built ship in general. It's got very sharp lines. It's a little bit smaller than previously believed. It's probably from the early 16th century, based on what we know about some of the artifacts and some of the other early sites that had now been studied since the 1960s. They threw out the idea that it could have been a slaving vessel or an exploration ship, probably not a privateer or a pirate, as that wasn't a common activity in the early 16th century. And the 2 likely candidates are either a caravel or what's called a small now. A now is more of a round-bellied ship, more of a cargo transport ship, but now in Spanish or Portuguese also means ship. So depending on its context, you can tell if an author is writing about an actual ship type called a now, which was specific, or generally speaking, nows, which just means ships. So it's always been a point of confusion. They came to the same conclusion, however, that the ship was in trouble and that they threw the heaviest anchor out to stop it, and that the ship did not sink rapidly or violently. They kind of disagreed with that 60s assessment, but they were basing that off the fact that the crew had time to move all their personal possessions and cargoes and other high value items off the ship. All the ship really sunk with was the bones itself, and then these cannons and anchors and all of the armament, the heavy stuff, sometimes lower in value, but also harder to salvage if you're on a sinking ship. So they took all the little light, expensive personal stuff, but left all the big heavy stuff. Interestingly enough, the 80s research never addressed the anchoring and current issue, that if you could completely clean out the ship within 5 or 6 hours before the ship had switched directions, with the current, that still is something that we don't know if it could happen, and it seems very difficult for it to happen in that situation. So it was still a bit of a mystery to me as I was rereading all this old research. That chart that you see on the right, this was every shipwreck they could find in the historical record between 1492 and 1520 for the New World, for the Americas. Total, they only found 1 ship that was recorded to have gone down somewhere in the Bahamas. That at the time that included the Turks and Caicos, that small island chain to the southeast. But within the area north of Cuba, north of Puerto Rico, but still off of the North American continent, there was only 1 set of ships that were lost, and that was lost by Vicente Yanez Pinzon. The Pinzons is a very famous family in Spanish history. They are the owners of Nina and possibly the other 2 ships. We don't really know. They sailed with Columbus. They were the original captains. They were responsible for getting the crew together from Palos, Spain, where Columbus got his ships and his crew from. So in many ways, they were the actual operators behind the voyage, where Columbus was a bit more of the figurehead. But Columbus did have plenty of sailing experience, but this was his first big venture. So the Pinzon family was very well known, and that was one of the reasons the crown kind of required them to go with. So they had a little bit more trust in the whole venture actually working out. Well, the problem with the Pinzon argument is that we know that they wrecked further down in the Turks and Caicos, several hundred miles away from where the shipwreck is found. And while that's still been debated, it seems relatively clear in my research that they are much further down into that region. They're nowhere near the central Bahamas. And based on the information that was available in 1500, they would have been able to describe it differently, as they had roots from Columbus and some other main areas that they wouldn't have misspoken quite to that degree in the records. So it didn't seem likely as the potential identity. The other big reason is that Pinzons, they lost 2 caravels in a violent hurricane that came up just before they returned to Spain. And every person and good was lost on both of those caravels, and they were never salvaged. There's quite detailed records of the transaction happening in a lawsuit that comes later, and we never get any inclination that Pinzon ships were salvaged or returned to, and things were lifted off the seafloor, which the Spanish did. But all hands were lost and all cargo was lost, and the ships were fully laden with goods they had picked up through South and Central America. So we don't see that represented in the archaeological record, and it's not in the right location. But interestingly, it's the only shipwreck that was able to be found in the record at the time. So coming forward, I began looking at this in 2012. I got to visit the site on a number of different occasions with volunteers from the Bahamas. We documented the ship, and one of the first things that jumped out to me was how beautiful, vibrant, and active the reef was. This region would have been very hard for a reef to grow in, mainly because of how shallow it is, how there's not a lot of other stones or corals in the area. Pretty much the only thing that the corals could grab onto was the shipwreck. So the shipwreck actually created this reef over the last 500 years. And much of the work that came before was not too concerned about damaging the reef in pursuit of learning about this wreck. As I dove further into that, one of my first careers was as a marine biologist. When I say careers, I mean I studied some of that in undergrad, but it was a real interest of mine. And so the idea that we're going to happily destroy a coral reef just to get to the shipwreck material seemed kind of at odds with each other. It seems like something we need to address and talk about more, that we can't just justify the destruction of a fragile, important resource in pursuit of another one. So we were trying to do many more versions of coral transplantations that went with the site, and do more of, if we're going to break a tree, let's plant a tree, or can we remove some of that stuff from the site before we intensively dig it up. So that was a big chunk of our work in 2017 as well. We got to do a lot of surveys of the islands. We had a great group. We had about 28 people over 8 weeks come and go from the site, help us with the excavation studies. We got a number of the locals involved as much as we could. And again, we got kicked off by Irma just a little too early. So we still have plenty more that we'd like to do down there, including recording of the hull. But we did get a lot of transplantation and excavation work done. So a lot we got to go on, at least. We got to map portions of the island with drones, build a lot of 3D models. It was a very useful tool. Just as an example, when you have a drone, the things you can do. Those 3 pictures on the bottom, those are satellite images, kind of the best the general public can access of different parts of the islands. And here, as you can see, this is the site that we were working on. Just below our ship is where we were doing our excavation. Well, it actually appears as a dark blue mass on Google Earth. So it's kind of interesting. You could actually see the wreck from a satellite, but certainly from a drone, you get a very different idea. Whether you'd identify that dark blue mass as a potential site is the other hard part. But when you look at the middle one, you can see a gray spot, and that's actually a modern wreck that the drone was very easily able to point out for us. So we got to go just to check it out because it looked anomalous when we did, but you can map much of the coastline just by using a drone. The second one is interesting. These are called banana holes to Bahamians, but they're also freshwater holes or limestone caves. So the island is riddled with caves, as is much of this region. And this probably provided some fresh water for any locals, the Lucayans, who were here before Spaniards, but it also could be a stop for Spaniards to come and spend some time to replenish their stores. Fresh water would be one of those things you'd have to find. Be hard to store for long periods. And if you didn't know where you were, you had to find those locations. So it would be one of the first things you'd mark on maps and take directions to, so you could tell your other sailors about it, which all kind of supports the idea that Highbourne Cay, the cut for transport, the wonderful anchorages and bays that are there, and the freshwater holes would have quickly become a known area for early Spanish seafaring in this area, a safe place, so to speak. Some more of the work that we got to do with the community, getting some participant interviews, working with some of the kids and teaching them about the coral restoration. Interestingly, one of the ways we got into kind of build rapport within the local community was by pointing to a lot of the work we were doing with the coral reef. Very few people are familiar with shipwrecks and maritime heritage in the Caribbean in general, nor do they put much importance on studying them, just because it's one of those foreign, relatively young ideas. If you connect it to the importance of the marine life, however, that was much more understandable. And so when we talk about both fragile resources as cultural resources and environmental resources, you start to build a different connection that wasn't there otherwise. So we did some coral transplantation and some fish biology to understand the site before and after we impact it, and can we regrow corals and transplant corals over time, kind of contribute to that component. We raised over 400 artifacts. Lots of different ceramics, but they're all very small, not a single intact vessel, which is kind of unique. There was one breached chamber, that kind of concreted yellowish object you see there in the center, would have been for one of the smaller swivel guns that was missed during the salvage in the 60s. But as I mentioned, Hurricane Irma was coming up, and we had the choice of either putting everything back and backfilling as rapidly as we could, but we got government permission and ultimately support from the island to cut open these old water tanks and turn them into artifact storage. And so even 4 years now since the 2017 season, we've been back and forth a number of times, and the island is still keeping these objects wet and sending us regular updates and making sure the objects are safe and secure as we're trying to get permissions from the government to ship them out of the country so we can get them analyzed. We want to do ceramic analysis and look at some of the wood samples that we took and a number of other things. COVID has been a big problem with all of this, but certainly then getting to the next stage of permitting and everything else has also been its fair set of challenges. But a lot of great things to look at, including some concretions that we can't quite identify if that's a knife sheath or something else similar. The only personal effect found on the site was a gold inlaid wooden handle of what looked like a knife. And we have about a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter drawing of it in the notes of the 60s salvers, and then a very brief description of the gold inlay. And that's it. That's all we've ever heard or seen of it, and no museum has it or other reference. So it's interesting. It's not an object you would have thrown overboard lightly, accidental. It would be wonderful if there was more of those types of materials, because it might tell us more about the wrecking event. But still, it seems to be rather anomalous. But then we have this small sheath. You just wonder if the two would have gone together and the whole knife was lost overboard. One of the best tools that we've got in the Caribbean, we don't get to do this here in St. Augustine too easily. It can happen, but the visibility is just so poor here compared to what you can do in these other places. But you can start to use photographs to build three-dimensional models. And the models can be scaled with incredible accuracy and be shared very easily. So what you see here is a top-down. It's essentially a site plan looking down on the shipwreck. When we got there, I believe this was in 2015. This was one of the first ones we did. And so when we build this, the whole thing is scaled, and each point has a location. So it's built of over 60 million points. So we can tell those points to tell us what's your elevation difference. And lo and behold, when we did this, something emerged that was only just kind of mentioned in brief, but seems to be rather important. What you're seeing there is what we call a DEM, a depth elevation model. The red is the high spots of the wreck. That's the ballast stone sticking up. That's the top, and you can see the outline of the wrecking site there. But that blue on the lower left is the really interesting. That's a depression. So that's actually below that green, which we said is our grade. And so you can see this semicircular shape to it. And I mentioned to you before that the keel had ground a hole, a trough into the limestone beneath the wreck. Well, it looks like that the port half of the ship had actually broken off at some point during the wrecking. The guns that were salvaged, as we can reconstruct, were found essentially in that blue area. So the guns kind of burst open part of the wreck, and that half of the ship fell down onto the seafloor and then was pinned beneath the guns for 500 years. And so it slowly grinded in that current back and forth, and it gouged this huge depression in the hardpan. We dug down in that depression and we got to a point of finding old white coral, so dead coral. The half of the ship had landed on a series of some corals that were down there, but we couldn't keep going. At some point, there was so much there, and it's such loose, coarse material that we had to have a different excavation strategy. So this is actually one of the areas that may return some artifacts that had never been seen or salvaged, or other materials that could tell us a lot more about the ship. But it's wonderful to see that site formation process kind of in action in such an interesting environment. Like I said, with the photogrammetry, we actually used these photograms every day or every other day to track excavation progress. So we could create a 3D scaled site plan of the shipwreck excavation underway. So you're seeing a rectangular area. That was our primary impact area. We cleared it of all living corals and sea fans and sea life the best we could, and slowly started coming from the bow and the stern. So we've cleared most of the loose material from those two ends. You can see a little bit of the trough and the timbers sticking out on the right and a little bit from the left. You can kind of see a gentle curve there on the left. That's actually the stem of the ship, the very bow piece. And then periodically we would do another photo model to document the progress. We had to put those sandbags, those white pillow looking things, on top of the timbers as they were exposed to make sure they didn't get loosed and fly away in the current. And so every time we exposed it, we'd put something else on, move to the next area, and kind of go and layer and layer. And this whole process took 3 or 4 weeks of chiseling free the concretions. Sometimes we had to be very patient with living moray eels and an octopus, and other creatures that decided to either inhabit the site before we got there or came by to feast on all the things that we were disturbing, the sea stars and other things. So we had a number of barracuda and parrotfish that would just be hanging out with us each and every day. We affectionately named Barry the barracuda, who very concerningly would hang out about 3 feet below the water, about 10 feet behind the ship. So you'd go diving every day and you'd drop in and you'd be staring at a barracuda not too far from you. And then you'd have to drop as fast as you could in the current to get to the bottom. And then the barracuda's just watching the whole time, just waiting for his snack. We did get to see some rather amazing things though. As the octopus was leaving, when we finally found where he was, we didn't want to disturb him too bad. So we kind of left the area for a bit to see if he would leave on his own. Well, one of our divers was down there doing some coral management and saw the octopus leave. But the octopus actually got snagged by a moray eel as it was leaving. And so there was a tense battle between octopus tentacle and moray eel before the moray eel chomped off the tentacle, and the tentacle still was wrapped around the moray eel's neck. And then all the other fish came and ate the tentacle off the moray eel's neck. Kind of a National Geographic sight to behold. Unfortunately, it wasn't on camera, but one of those stories you probably won't find unless you're actively disturbing a reef. As you're going here, you're just kind of seeing the ship getting uncovered. We're getting down to the remaining hull, clearing off a lot of the sand and sediments in the area. This was the strategy, more or less. We got to expose most of it for one couple of shots, but it was only right before Hurricane Irma, so we didn't want to leave it too exposed for too long before we had to backfill. So this served for us to kind of put all of this together into a timber plan or site plans that we could see the whole ship and all of its contents, all of its timbers at least, within that environment. And I'll show you another shot of it here in a sec. But this is the most intact hull of an early 16th century shipwreck we know about. We have bow to stern represented, a good chunk of the side. Kind of on the lower left, you can see there's one little excavation area that was following the timbers down. There's still a lot more for us to excavate going down into that depression that I showed you. And we're not really sure where it all stops. So it's a very exciting ship to be able to try to reconstruct as well because of its importance. So this is a one shot right before backfill. You can see we've staged all the stones around the bow, some of the stern. Hurricane Irma is about 3 days away, so we had to do this as quickly as possible. But that was the full exposed shipwreck at the time. After this, we put all the stones down, used landscaping cloth, backfilled as much as we could with sediments, did another round of stones. And the joy of diving in the Bahamas again is because of how clear and shallow it was, we could actually rig up floodlights on the back of the boat. And so we could dive until about midnight just from the light of those floodlights. And so this was about 16 hours straight of diving. Because of how shallow it is, we didn't have to worry too much about decompression. Just be kind of mindful you didn't cross the 9-hour total mark, but that was hard enough to do. So in a very short period of time, we could get the site covered back up. As I talk about the kind of the rareness of caravels, one of the more interesting things is that we have a lot of descriptions, but not many drawings. And so you can see that little square I have up there. That's what we consider to be the best example of a caravel in iconography, in pictures. That's mainly because the artist that painted this painting and others is very well known for his architectural accuracy with all sorts of things. This painting is about 3 feet by 5 feet. That caravel is about 2 inches by 2 inches. And so it's amazing when we call that the best example of a caravel that we have record of. And it's so small, but you can still see a lot of the rigging, and the ship actually looks like it's in the water rather than floating on top, and a number of other things. But we just don't know much about them. Calculating tonnages for the ship as best we can. This is one of the smaller ships that we've got, and that matches our understanding of the caravel. We'd expect it to be somewhere between 50 and 150 tons, and this one's right around 100 tons. So it's matching that approximate size. So when we come back to this original story, now we've got all this great information from 60 years, 3 different researchers doing the work. What have we found and what have we learned, and what are our prevailing questions? Well, I kind of mentioned my problem with this anchoring scenario. And if any of you are captains or have done any sailing, you can ask yourself this too, because it's still a modern question. Even if you are manning the pumps and your vessel is in desperation, you clearly have enough time to still get all of the crew's possessions and other things off the ship. But why would you anchor so close to the shore if you're in such an emergency? One answer might be, well, you want to get to the shore as quick as possible and off. You know, you're going to take the risk of getting blown ashore. But you could just travel another 1,000 meters, a kilometer. You could literally float with the current to the south, as you can see, and you'll wind up in a very shallow bay. That's an excellent anchorage. That's safe and protected. You could even run it aground. So if your ship is destined to sink, well, it sinks on sand. You have all the time in the world to get whatever you'd want out of it. So to put yourself off of a rocky coast where there is no place to take a boat to, you still have to travel south to that next beach area to get your people off of the ship. It's all anomalous. It all seems like a very strange thing to do. Well, one of the unique things that gets mentioned and kind of discarded is in the 1980s, they were talking with some of the island owners, and it turns out one of the salvors from the 60s actually came back to the site in 1974. Again, the archaeologists were there in 86. So in 74, he came back and was looking around the same area and found another anchor. He raised that anchor, and with the help of the island owner at the time, and they put it at Highbourne Cay dock. And so they put it, and I think I have a shot, here's this one. It's just below the dock in about 5 feet of water. It still sits there. And this anchor was raised, and they still debate whether or not it's associated with the site or not. So we don't know where this object was removed from, one of the frustrations of working on sites that have been disturbed. But we know it's from the general area of the site. And one of the guys that helped raise the anchor, he was 16 or 17 at the time that we talked to, he swears it's from that area right there. This is literally where you guys are mooring your ship is where we moored our ship. Well, in the 60s, they found 3 anchors, one on top of the ballast that you saw in the video getting removed, and 2 off the bow of the ship, the ones we talk about that were thrown out to stop the vessel. I think what's more likely is that if we can date that anchor appropriately, that ship represents a 4th anchor that would have been off the stern. And so a very common mooring, especially if you're in this type of environment, would be to use a Y mooring, where essentially 2 anchors off your bow, pointing your bow in the fastest current direction, and 1 anchor off your stern to help hold you on the receding tide. As I look at this anchor, we see all of the hallmarks of a 16th century anchor, even though the team in the 1980s said they didn't think it was from the 80s. So we have a cordial disagreement between archaeologists. A couple of features, you can see a real sharp triangle palm there in the lower left. It's not a spade shaped like you see with many later anchors. So this is an early 16th century shape. The long spindly shank matches what we see of Spanish anchors. This would be smaller, and the ratio would be a little different from some of the other Spanish anchors we've seen. So it could throw it into question, but it falls within the range. And so it's hard to say, you can't throw it out just based on that information. Another one that's kind of hard to see in this picture, but if you see that ring down on the right-hand picture, there are 2 nubs just below that ring on the shaft that are sticking out to the side. Where those two nubs, what are called keys or stock nuts, they hold the stock onto that anchor. And so that stock would have been wooden. Only in the 16th century do we see anchors with stock nuts or stock keys on that side of the anchor shaft. Every other example of later Spanish anchors and later anchors in general, they're on the top and bottom face. So they're on the opposite faces as the palms and the arms of the anchor. This one, they're parallel. They're on the same side of the palms. And I think that's some of our best evidence to say this has got to be a 16th century anchor. And there's no other known or 16th century material in the area. This shipwreck came from the general area. It would be silly to almost assume that this anchor did not come from that shipwreck. We know that the guys in the 1960s that salvaged the materials, well, they clearly looked around the site really well because they raised all the cannons and they raised the anchor off the shipwreck itself. And they found the anchors to the north. They found the anchors off the bow of the ship, those two up there. It would make sense that the anchor that they missed was to the stern, was to the south, and it would have been more camouflaged as there is more marine growth to the south. So while it is conjectural, it does help support the idea that rather than this ship coming around in an emergency about ready to sink and anchoring in this weird spot and unloading the ship in a very rapid time, that we see a ship that was moored here intentionally, that perhaps it was getting fresh water, perhaps it was hiding from a storm. That's why it's so close to the side. But we see it on a 3-point anchor, and it was sitting there intentionally for at least some period of time. It also supports the idea that when the ship wrecked, if it was only off those bow anchors, you would think that when the current switched, it might shift the whole ship forward towards these other two anchors, because now you have this massive structure that's taking up much of the water column, pushing it forward. We don't see that because we see that gouge, that trough in the limestone of the ship rocking back and forth. We don't see it sliding at all. We see the terminus of the end of the ship, and we see the bow, that stem piece. So we know that it didn't slide back and forth with the current. It was stuck, which would help indicate that it was anchored from the rear as much as it was from the bow. So I think there's a couple of lines of evidence, but that would, to me, make a lot more sense. One of the prevailing questions still is, well, why did it not go back into the harbor? Why did it not go back another 1,000 meters into this safer moorage area? And that's one of the interesting things as we go forward. So my last slide here as I wrap up, and I'll take some questions, but we have found now 3 different references to ships that wrecked somewhere in the Bahamas in that early 16th century. One is the first one I talked about that they had found in the 80s, the wrecks of Pinzon. The caravels were found much further to the south. Down here in the southeast, again, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but down here, those were a total loss of life and cargo. They were never salvaged. They're not in the right area, etc. So I think that it's less likely that it would have been one of those wrecks. We also were told that those wrecks hit a coral reef and wrecked on the reef, and we just don't see that occurring at the Highbourne Cay wreck. We have another reference that a scholar, Paul Hoffman, writes about, but there was a lawsuit for some claims to an insurance, but there was a slaving set of ships that went north in 1516 through the Bahamas. They reportedly 2 vessels filled their ships with Lucayans from the area, enslaved peoples, and upon sailing back, only 1 ship returned. And so presumably the other vessel was lost with all hands somewhere within the Bahamas, but we still don't know anything else about that. It's just a blip in the record. Perhaps it returned elsewhere after, and it was on Cuba, and it took a while for the 2 to connect, and the deposition for the lawsuit already took place, and we just don't have a record. Perhaps it was lost in deep water, and we'll never see it. Perhaps there's yet another 16th century shipwreck out there. But what we don't see at the Highbourne Cay wreck is we see a lot of ballast. We don't see evidence of them taking the ballast off to make room even for human cargo. And we don't see a lot of Lucayan artifacts. We might see some pottery fragments, but there's no other bits of guanine, which is like a little cheap gold substance that they had as a decoration. There's no slave monocles or chains or anything else from this site that would indicate it wrecked with a load of human cargo and all of the sailors and everyone else on the ship itself. So we just don't see that. The one fascinating one that we have found is that Ponce de Leon, on his journey, he left in 1513 from Puerto Rico, and he sails up through the Bahamas, and he's giving pretty good directions as he goes. He's giving a distance and a degree, and every now and then describes several latitudes before he eventually lands on the coast of Florida, becoming the first person supposedly landing around here in St. Augustine, landing in North America, the first European. He sails down south, discovers the Florida Keys and names them a variety of names, comes into the Gulf and becomes the first European in the Gulf, encounters some hostile natives, and so he turns around and sails back down to Cuba before recognizing that it is in fact Cuba, bounces back up into the Keys, and from there he describes how they really are looking for this mythical land of Bimini. Bimini was kind of the quest that Ponce set off on. He was never looking for a fountain of youth. That was attributed to him much later. So his journey was all about finding this kingdom of Bimini and this wealth that was said to be present, but he couldn't find it. So his record describes, and we've tried to follow this part very closely, as he enters into the Western Bahamas, he meets up with another ship, and he describes it as a small ship off seeking its fortune, piloted by a gentleman named Diego Miruelo. And Miruelo, we don't know much about him. We know that he was an active pilot from several other accounts. He also, very confusingly, has an uncle by the exact same name who was also a pilot in the early 16th century in the Bahamas. So we have two people that we know are two separate humans, but their name appears almost identical at different points throughout the period. Trying to tease out who was who and who was doing what is challenging, but the name is out there as a pilot for hire on different voyages. And so he meets up with Diego Miruelo, and they sail together for about 2 months. About 4 or 5 weeks of it, they are mentioning different locations in the Western Bahamas. We try to trace their route, but they seem to stay in the Western Bahamas. They talk about the currents of the Florida Strait, and then they decide to start sailing back east, back through the Central Bahamas. Well, they're trying to reach an island that they named called Guanima, and we've got this on several maps, and it looks like Cat Island, well, which is right over here if you can see my cursor. If not, it's the intersection between that dashed yellow line and the red circle down on the lower right side of that circle. There's an island called Cat Island. Well, they're trying to sail there, and they run into contrary winds and they can't quite reach it. So they say they turn around and they seek shelter at an island called Guatao. This is where Highbourne Cay is. And so you can see if you're en route to Cat Island and you turned around, you might find yourself in the northern Exumas. Interestingly, they take shelter at this island of Guatao for 4 weeks. It's the longest stop anytime on Ponce's voyage. Their vessels are described as being overhauled, which generally means that they're being careened. There is that shallow beach I mentioned on the maps that is probably a right slope. You need a very specific slope to careen a ship. It's that kind of slope. I couldn't speak directly to if the degrees are perfect, but it would make sense that's where they would have anchored. It's the safest harbor in the area as well. But that would mean that 4 ships all anchored in that little area of Highbourne Cay for about 4 weeks before they say that Miruelo's vessel sinks at anchor. The crew is rescued by Ponce. He brings everybody aboard his ships, and he sails 2 of his ships back home to Puerto Rico. It ends his famous voyage. He sends 1 ship off to look for Bimini again, which it comes back a few weeks after Ponce arrives in Puerto Rico. But essentially that was the end of the voyage. But we know that this ship wrecked at anchor, that the crew had time to be salvaged. They stayed there for a long period, and it helps, in my mind, as I'll go back, it helps describe why we see this shipwreck up in the current next to the coast. Because if you can imagine down south on the lower part of that map, you can see an anchor image next to the word surge. That is the best anchorage on the island. That's also where Ponce would have anchored his ships. So there would have been no contest about who would have had the best seat in the house, so to speak. And so his 3 ships would have been down in this area, probably dotting along the coast as it goes up. And Maruelos would make sense if he was anchored outside the marina. Again, they take up about 600 meters of space with their anchors fully out. And so each ship would need sufficient spacing. And then one ship would be rotating with another to be careened on the beach down here to the south. And so that identity, if we can concretely call it Maruelos' vessel, it matches all of the archaeological evidence that we've got, especially if you consider it's on a stern anchor. It matches that the objects were removed from the crew and they would have taken the water and the food and the navigational devices and everything else, and why that ship would have been in that area and for how long. So it kind of helps us understand that situation. It fits very neatly. It's hard to call it a concrete evidence as of yet. And so we hope to go back and keep doing some analysis on the artifacts to try to get clearly early dates from some carbon dating, from some dendroarchaeology, dendrochronology if we can, ceramic analysis, etc. But that's all kind of a part of the next process. So I hope that's entertaining. I hope I didn't go too long here. I always seem to on this site. A big thanks to everyone that helped us with this. Here at the lighthouse, the St. Augustine Lighthouse, we were hoping to get back into the Bahamas here at the early part of next year. If we can get permission, bring those artifacts here to LAMP and study some of them and send the rest off for samples, and then possibly keep pursuing this research if we can and make this identity or not. So it'll be an exciting one either way. And whether or not the ship is Ponce de Leon's, it still is a very important, historically significant vessel just based on its ship type and its period and the rarity that we've got for surviving ships of the era. So thank you. That's everything. I hope you guys enjoyed it all, and I'm happy to take questions here.
I'll start off with the leading question. Thank you for presenting tonight. I noticed in your very first slide, like your last slide, you have lots of logos there, but there appears to be room for the Maritime Heritage Chapter logo as well. So I hope you'd consider inviting us down if there's when there's another expedition down south. I know we've got a lot of good talent here in the group.
There's always room for more logos, and it would be an absolute pleasure to have you all. So yeah, no, I certainly hope to build knowledge of the site and interest as well. So anyone that can make it when and if it happens is always welcome to.
Sure. All right, standing by for questions.
Yeah, I didn't look in the chat. I can look down here. Thank you for the thanks, but I didn't see any typed in. Otherwise, Brendan, you can always send around my email, and if anyone is interested with more questions or wants more information, I am happy to send off whatever I have or keep chatting. I find the topic absolutely fascinating. So,
you have a bumper crop of attendees tonight. This is one of the largest ones we've had in a while, so I'm glad to see the interest in that. And the only questions I've had tonight are from some of our attendees who didn't get the invite directly, and so I'll make sure that that happens. We have folks outside of our organization that want it, so that's good. I do have a question here. I don't know, Nick, if you can see that. There's a couple questions here. What happened to the other ships like the one in Molasses Reef?
No, that's fantastic. The Molasses Reef story is, I think, one of the more dramatic of stories. That one was first found by treasure hunters, I believe in 1982, and they claimed it was Columbus's Pinta right off the bat, just because they wanted to. They brought a lot of attention to it, and the Turks and Caicos government reached out to Texas A&M to send some archaeologists to verify. And when they got there, they said it is in fact early, but there's no evidence to support it being Pinta. There's a couple things that suggest it's not, and we don't even know if Pinta actually shipwrecked. It's all kind of conjectural. So the Turks and Caicos government gave the permit to the archaeologists to work at the site. And before the archaeologists got to go out and work, there was a pipe bomb that was detonated on the wreck, and it blew up a large chunk of the site, ruining a lot of the materials and kind of scrambling a lot of the inside context of the artifacts. So that was always a tragedy. From what could be excavated from that site, it now forms part of a museum in the Turks and Caicos, if you ever go there. But they couldn't really preserve many of the timbers. There's been discussions to how or why it didn't work very well. And my thought has always been that the detonation from the pipe bomb actually damaged a lot of the very fragile wood cells with the shockwave. And the wood cells of the timbers don't hold enough PEG, this chemical, to preserve it. So that it doesn't actually preserve very well. It needs to retain that PEG to stay above water. So interestingly enough, that site kind of got damaged in its own way. One of the other ones, it's known as the Bahia Mujeres site. It's off the coast of Mexico. That one was looked at in the 50s and had been salvaged a couple of times by different groups. That one is still kind of a big mystery. I would love to go look at the site. We've talked about it before. It's a part of a much larger reef structure. So unlike Highbourne Cay that wrecked in a relatively barren area and turned into a reef, Bahia Mujeres wrecked on a reef and has now been encapsulated by the reef. So we hope work like we were doing with the coral reef transplantation can demonstrate to environmental groups that there's a component to work together, that we might be able to preserve or at least mitigate impact. So we can look and see if there are any timbers that survive there or any other artifacts. But other than minor surveys at the site, nothing was really done. So it kind of awaits further information. The last of them is another tragedy. So the one that was found in Panama, it's the most recently found site in 2001. My professor who I was working under, Dr. Felipe Castro, he went to visit the site at the request of the Panamanian government. And when they looked at it, they said, sure enough, this is very early. It has all the hallmarks. But there was a treasure hunting group out of Florida that was also vying for the Panamanians' attention. And so the treasure hunters actually promised a lot of income if they were given the permits, that they would not only build a museum, but the sale of all the treasure would return lots of money, and a big chunk of it would be donated to the country. So Panama actually became the first or the fastest country to sign this international convention, the UNESCO convention, to protect their underwater heritage. And then 3 months later, they signed a permit to treasure hunters to loot a very early shipwreck site. So we have a little bit of documentation from Dr. Castro's visits, but then very quickly he wasn't allowed to go back to that site because it was under permit by someone else. All we know that it kind of disappeared in 2004. A lot of the cannons and things were just removed, and when they didn't find any treasure, that treasure hunting group left, and nothing really came of it except a whole bunch of artifacts got removed from the ocean. The story I've heard is a very kind elderly woman that lives near the site actually allowed so the government to build some concrete vats, and so some of the cannons and things are still in storage vats for the last 15 years by her house. And that might be the end of the story. We don't really know if something else happens, but it would be yet another site to get to go back and look at. Wood was found, and it has potential for not only a very early date, but some very neat archaeology. So all of these sites have further potential, and I would love to be a part of going to them, and I think there's a number of people that would too. So building up the search for the early Iberian shipwrecks, yet again, is definitely something of interest.
Well, speaking of some other early shipwrecks, don't forget next month, November 16th, a Tuesday at 6 p.m., we're going to be joined by Dr. Chris Sorrell to discuss the search for the lost ships of Hernan Cortez down in the Western Caribbean. So that should be that's another fascinating collaborative project that's ongoing. And we're lucky to be joined by him. And then the next presentation after that has not been scheduled yet. Will probably be January. And that will be by a soon-to-be new graduate from East Carolina University on a wreck in Washington, North Carolina, which is very similar to one of those that we documented. And Nick was on that project down in the Nansemond River here in Virginia. So anyway, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Unless anybody has any other questions, I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm happy to share Nick's email, and if you when you go to Florida, make sure you visit the St. Augustine Lighthouse Museum.
Please do.
Great research program down there. I'm biased, I know, but it's true. And anyway, but thank you for joining us, everybody. It's great to see you, and y'all have a great evening, and see you around the field.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick.